Good morning, colleagues. The Executive Dean of the College of Human Sciences, Prof. Z. Tunkosi, Deputy Executive Dean, Professor Derek Mashau, Director of the School of Humanities, Professor Mokele Madiso will be joining us, Head of Research and Postgraduate Studies in the College, Professor Bosire Onyancha, Director of the School of Arts, Professor Siasanga Dali, our honored guest, Professor Lynn OSSOME, our college marketing team, the multimedia team, and our colleagues who are joining us online. These are colleagues at our regional office in Ethiopia, our colleagues in Makerere University, Uganda, where our speaker is coming from, and our other colleagues who are in conferences in the USA who are joining us online. Our dear students, colleagues from our sister colleges, colleagues from CHS, good morning. Sanbonani, Dumelang, Jambo, Molweni, Khuyamore, Lochani. Today, the 22nd of July, 2024, is another important and exciting day in the calendar of not just the College of Human Sciences, but the University of South Africa at large. This is another of the many days where we have gathered together to feast from the distinguished scholars that we invite to deliver lectures for the Africa Speaks lecture series in the College of Human Sciences. Africa Speaks is one of the College of Human Sciences' most prestigious flagship projects that provide a platform for Africa's most prominent voices to indeed speak. Africa Speaks started many years ago. It is a project that was not seen as only being beneficial to the College of Human Sciences, but to the university as a whole. And when it started, it was called the African Visiting Scholar of the Month. And it was established to achieve a number of objectives aimed at improving the research capacity of the college and enhancing a critical discourse by its academics with African intellectuals on the African continent and in the diaspora. Through this Africa Speaks lecture series, the college has over the years invited reputable scholars, the likes of Professor Olokushe Adibayo, who delivered in the same room here the inaugural lecture of this Africa Speaks in 2001. We have actually come back to where it all started after COVID-19. At the time, he was, you know this, he was the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Sciences Research in Africa, CODESRIA. And then we have other speakers, the likes of Ms. Sisi Dangaremba from Zimbabwe, Professor Nomalanga Mkize, Professor Shosi Kesi, and many more. The 2024 inaugural lecture was delivered by a writer, a storyteller, Ms. Yvonne Oua. Ms. Oua is Kenyan and also linked to CODESRIA. Today we are hosting Professor Lynn OSSOME, who is Kenyan and the current president of CODESRIA. Colleagues, for some reasons, something led the organizing committee to East Africa for Scholars for 2024. This was not intentional, but I think it was time that we look to East Africa, because I do not remember the College of Human Sciences hosting a speaker from there. Most of our speakers have been from West Africa and Southern Africa. The cherry on top is that they both have links with CODESRIA. Myself and other colleagues had an opportunity to attend the CODESRIA assembly in 2019, where we engaged with best crop in Africa, and that is where we came across, the work of Professor OSSOME and Ms. Owa at that assembly. CODESRIA remains a space to engage the best African scholars in Africa and in the diaspora. Starting with the very first lecture that was delivered by Professor Olokushe Adibayo, then Ms. Owa, and today Professor OSSOME. It is evident that CODESRIA is the shopping mall for leading scholars in Africa. These are the scholars with great wealth to guide us in all our transformation and endeavors, to guide us on decoloniality discourse and also Africanization. Moving along, I'm now going to call on Professor Zethu Nkosi to open this, because if Professor Nkosi doesn't open this, we are not going to eat. So I have to make sure that she opens this, and then she tells us that after this, you can go and have the lunch that has been organized. Professor Nkosi.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So now Professor Nkosi is with food. Welcome, Prof. OSSOME. We are really grateful as a College of Human Science that you responded to our call. Before I start, colleagues, Prof. Linkabule is the one who was supposed to do the opening, but due to competing interests, she delegated that I welcome you all, but she will keep on peeping online to engage with the discussion. It is my singular honor to welcome you all to the Africa Speaks event, which is an initiative that has demonstrated how the university enables Africa's greatest sons and daughters to share their critical thoughts and work about this great continent. Ms. Mahupi shared with you the journey that we had as a College of Human Sciences. This Africa Speaks, we are in year, is it year 10, Winnie? Is it year 10 or year? 2009. We are more than 15 years having Africa Speaks, and we are targeting our colleagues from the diaspora because we believe that as Africa, as Africans, we can generate knowledge that can change the world. Ladies and gentlemen, this event demonstrates our university's commitment to critical scholarship and to reclaiming our intellectual futures. I find the theme appealing to the direction that UNISA is taking, in so much as grappling with the question of gender and the many ways in which Western-centric ways of being have over the years oppressed women, and particularly African women in the context of our continent. And so, as we embark on the journey of reclaiming our intellectual features, and as UNISA finds its footing in this greater conversation about emancipation of women from the stranglehold of coloniality, we, as the College of Human Sciences and the University of South Africa, have committed ourselves to the cause through the catalytic niche areas. You know, I'm speaking the language of the VC the minute I mention catalytic niche areas, because it's the vision that she's directing the university with. Whilst we have our 10 catalytic niche areas, which includes the marine studies, energy, automotive, aviation, and aeronautical studies, space studies, and square kilometer area, fourth industrial revolution and digitization, biotechnical studies, health and pharmacology studies, student support, and co-curricular studies. It is feminist, womanist, and Busadi theorization work that should give expression to the just, intellectual, and everyday features that we are imagining and reclaiming as a university. In trying to remember Africa from her dismembered self in this university, we are convinced that feminist, womanist, and Busadi theorization conversations are the missing link in the continent's quest to reclaim its intellectual features. In her acclaimed essay, We Should All Be Feminist, Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi writes, the problem with gender is that it prescribes how we should be rather than recognizing how we are. Imagine how much happier we'll be, how much freer to be our true individual self if we didn't have the weight of gender expectations. We appreciate the males that are in the audience because they support the cause of Busadi theorization. And so, as we lay our stake in the feminist, humanist, and Busadi theorization work, and as we aim to make an impact on this topic as a university, we are excited to welcome Prof. MARILYN OSSOME at the University of South Africa, which is the University of the Land. We look forward to a talk that weaves the concept of feminism, gendered labor, and inequalities, and how these find expression in financialized capital. In Teaching to Transgress, the writer and theorist Bell Hooks writes about a new kind of education as the practice of freedom. Teaching students to transgress against racial, sexual, and class boundaries in order to achieve the gift of freedom is for Hooks the teacher's most important goal. Similarly, what if the African continent begins to transgress against the gendered norms of capitalist and colonial systems that have dismembered the African continent from herself? These questions are at the center of how we imagine the feminist, humanist, and Busadi theorization work that is being pursued by the academics at this university. At the College of Human Sciences, we are excited by how academics have embraced this catalytic niche area, and we are convinced that in doing so, the work that is being done will enrich the souls of our continent and pave the way for a brighter, more inclusive future for all. It is on that basis that we have also positioned the concept of feminist, humanist, and Busadi theorization as a catalytic niche area. These catalytic niche areas in their nature, they spark national and continental debates and are meant to have a greater tangible impact and change on society. Today, we are particularly encouraged by how the work that she's pursuing complements and is in conversation with some of the work that is pursued by the university. Having said above, I would love to express a hearty warm welcome to all of you, and may this day be one where we're able to understand how the work that is being done by academics and support staff is playing a role on reclaiming of African intellectual features. Ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Professor Nkosi, for that warm welcome to Prof. OSSOME and also the colleagues that are in this room and those that are online. And thank you so much, for situating Professor OSSOME's title for today to one of our niche areas, that is feminism, humanism, Busadi theorization. Thank you so much, Prof. Colleagues, we are now getting to the serious business of today, whereby we are going to give our speaker a chance to deliver what, she has prepared for us. We're just sitting there at her feet today to feast. Professor OSSOME is MARILYN OSSOME is Associate Professor and Director of Makerere Institute of Social Research, MISA, at the Makerere University, and has taught at Wits University and Yale University as a visiting presidential professor. She holds a doctorate in political studies from Wits University with specializations in the fields of feminist political economy and feminist political theory, and research interest in gendered labor, land and agrarian questions, the modern state and the political economy of gendered violence. Her books include Gender, Ethnicity and Violence in Kenya's Transitions to Democracy, States of Violence, published in 2018, and the co-edited volume, Labor Questions in the Global South, published in 2021. She serves on numerous boards, is editor of Feminist Africa, co-editor of the Journal for Contemporary African Studies, and editorial board member of Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy, and is affiliated with many feminist and agrarian organizations and movements in Africa. She is the current president of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA. This is just a short biography. If you're interested, you can access Professor OSSOME's CV online. It is so impressive, so amazing. You look at also his publications. Professor OSSOME, can we just give a round of applause, colleagues?
Thank you for that generous introduction. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Vice Chancellor, who's not with us, the Executive Dean, Professor Zetu Nkosi, the Deputy Executive Dean, Professor Derek Mashao, the Director, School of Humanities, Professor Mohele Madise, Head of Research and Postgraduate Studies, Professor Bosire Onyancha, who I believe is my compatriot, or I hope he is. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking time to join me. I'm very pleased to be here. I've always seen UNISA from a distance. I've always wanted to be here. So the title of my lecture today is Imperialism and Crisis of Social Reproduction in Africa. So to begin with, I want to state a fairly obvious point. And that point is that gender inequalities feature in the prevailing model of financialized capitalist development, the contemporary form of development that we are sitting with. In the peripheries, Africa, much of the third world, capitalist development is increasingly dependent on enclosures of land, of nature. It is also dependent, it's creating a significant amount of debt that is being transferred to households. It's being shifted onto households. Capitalism, or this current model of development, is also highly dependent generally deepens exploitation of gendered labor for service and for industry. The other ambiguous reality is that these conditions of accumulation have serious implications for working people and surplus populations of the global south who depend on these resources. A lot of the reality actually in Africa today and much of the third world is that many households can no longer actually reproduce themselves only on wages. Many households now depend on a combination of wages, some kind of access to land for subsistence, some kind of petty commodity production. So land, when we talk about land, when we, especially the global South third world theorizations of land, can no longer just look at land as this thing that, we don't want it just to hold title and property. A lot of people of the global South recognize that we are going to starve. There are massive amounts of people who are being expended from industry and from manufacturing. The basis of land constitutes a basis of survival. And not just land, also nature, commons, and the gendered labor that turns this land into use value. So the question of survival is fundamental. This dual tension suggests a gendered labor substratum of core-periphery imperialist relations of accumulation that requires elaboration and which should concern all of us in the third world. This is because, why should it concern us? Why should these questions of the extreme inequalities that we are seeing, that we can't think of the inequalities on the continent without thinking of the global accumulation, which is why I'm thinking about it in the context of global capitalism and in relation to imperialism. So first, these gendered inequalities constitute a central contradiction in social movements. They undermine inequalities inside our movements. We tend to think, when we think, for example, about the peasantry, which we tend to romanticize, even the working class people, there is a lot of difference and inequality and contradictions inside those movements, and we have to be paying attention to them, and we have to be thinking about them. Otherwise, we will deliver the peasantry to the utopia we want, but we will leave intact the kind of structural basis that reproduces those movements. So and gender inequalities, as Professor Nkosi was very rightly saying, I don't know if there's any possibility of liberation without taking this question seriously. So gender inequalities constitute a central contradiction in social movements. They undermine both solidarity and strategy among working people, and the fractures that emerge must be addressed as a condition for post-colonial development. Second, this crisis of social reproduction, and when I'm talking about the crisis of social reproduction, is fundamentally that the system of development that we are sitting with, capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, imperialism, depends on reproductive labor, on a gendered structure to which it doesn't invest. It depends on a structure for its own reproduction, but it doesn't put any resources and funding or investment into that. So we saw this very clearly during the COVID pandemic. Feminist scholars, feminist economists have been talking about this for a very long time. There is a terminology now, the concept of care economies, of care work, which is, even the World Bank is talking about the care economy. And the World Bank is saying we must make care economies more caring. Care economies are serious. They are an indictment of a system of development that depends on a realm which it doesn't reproduce itself. And we saw this. We saw what happened during COVID when the wage economy basically shut down. And a lot of, especially during the hard lockdown, if you didn't have a state, the South African state did quite a bit with the social, the SRD grant, I think. There were many countries, even the most neoliberal of states, had to put some money into reproducing the most vulnerable of their societies, fundamentally because states still need to manufacture some kind of consent to govern. And so they are going to put some money in. But we also saw a lot of, what they were calling essential services and essential domains, which was the household, which was the nursing labor, and so on. So this crisis of social reproduction, which is germane to capitalism, finds varied expression in the core countries, in advanced capitalist countries, and somehow different expressions in the peripheries, in the sort of global south. In the global south, what I like to think of as the agrarian south, partly because of the significance that land and landed resources still constitute in relation to food and survival of the people. In the agrarian south, access to land, nature, and the commons constitute the major or a major reproductive possibility at the same time as it raises an agrarian question of gendered labor. Therefore, the ongoing reproductive crisis links land, gendered labor. I can't talk about it as just labor in general, but gendered, not just because it's women's labor, but it's organized around a structure, a gendered structure. It includes work. It's work done predominantly, but not exclusively by women. Men also do this work. Children also do this work. So this reproductive crisis links gendered labor and land in ways that any agrarian reform has to account for. Again, there's no distribution of land if you're not thinking about the contradictions and the inequalities that are inherent to working people. The third world must address, we must also address questions of national sovereignty and national liberation. As you know, you cannot talk about, there's a lot of discussion everywhere across the continent. We are seeing some kind of movements or shifts in the political approach of, think about the West African nations, where who are trying to regain sovereignty over their minerals and this kind of thing. The question of regaining or turning this into productive industries and economies, whether it's land, whether it's minerals, cannot be thought of without taking seriously the questions of sovereignty of our nations, and that question of sovereignty, that question of national liberation, has social dimensions, it has cultural dimensions, and it has political dimensions. So my task today is to reflect on these issues and examine how, in turn, they reconstitute the conditions of survival and reproduction of working people in Africa. So by way of an introduction, the structural relationship between gender and imperialism has, in the main, been theorized in relation to, in the literature that the prevailing literature has theorized it in relation to the servitude of colonized women to empire. The literature examines women in systems of unfree labor, such as slavery, convict settlements, indentured work, and evaluates the role of gender, sex, and sexuality in the history of structuring imperialist systems. There are also important critiques by feminist thinkers of Islam of the perverse logics through which Western imperial power seeks to justify the geopolitical domination by posing, its geopolitical domination by posing as the liberator of indigenous women from native patriarchal cultures, and therefore laying bare Euro-American domination of the Muslim world and its particular indebtedness to key tropes within Western feminist discourse. Others expose the gendered dimensions of the global inequality created by international systems that emerged at the end of colonialism and show how modernization has been accompanied by the systematic pauperization of the third world. There is also general convergence around the fact that colonial systems in the late 19th and early 20th century were indelibly marked by gendered forms of exploitation and oppression. Marginalized feminist histories or histories from the margins of empire demonstrate several respects in which such exploitation was exemplified. Relevant examples here include the military comfort system used by Imperial Japan, that was then the colonial power in East Asia during the Sino-Japanese War. In the lead up to World War II, Japanese armed forces established comfort stations in mainland China, where Chinese women were enslaved and subjected to sexual violence. While military-aged Chinese males were summarily executed or conscripted into forced labor schemes, Chinese women of childbearing age were systematically raped or forced into sex slavery, primarily because Chinese women were viewed as the embodiment of the Chinese nation, that is, women as boundaries of the nation, onto which identities of race, ethnicity, and sexuality are mapped and instrumentalized by the state and capital. In this regard and legacy, the feminist scholarship understands gendered violence of the gendered violence of the post-colonial nation state as being a problem of nationalism that is, in fact, the product of imperialism, and therefore deeply implicated in imperialism's violent structure. Imperialist wars have also constituted a basis of reproductive labor in the colonies and in the contemporary period in Africa. We know, for instance, of the complexities surrounding wartime prostitution in Nairobi, following a sudden increase in urban populations to meet the city's labor requirements during World War II. This included an influx of British imperial troops and Italian prisoners of war, as well as native laborers in search of productive wage employment or reproductive work. Prostitution expanded and evolved to accommodate the special conditions and burdens of wartime Nairobi, often reflecting the size and characteristics of the male workforce. History tells us in this regard that during times of imperialist crisis, the costs of empire are borne primarily by the subjects of empire, not least its female subjects. A brief typology of empire, as applied, as I'm thinking about it in this text, is necessary here. So all colonies from the late 19th century were embedded in the global system of capitalist exploitation and extraction that typifies imperialism. Although some distinction pertains between the two, we have to make a distinction between colonialism and imperialism. In his description, Samir Amin draws a distinction between the imperialism that emerged around 1880, along with the monopolies as the main crisis of the world. This imperialism is not to be confused with colonialism or expansionism. The imperatives and effects of imperialism were distinct. The implementation, imperialism is the result of the growing centralization of capital and tends to aggravate uneven development. The implementation of colonial policies during taxation, including taxation, land alienation, forced migrant labor, indirect rule, peasant commodity production, and settler estate agriculture, raised a series of contradictions in this context of dominance, of monopolies and establishment of finance capital. Today, a neo-colonial situation pertains as the primary instrument of imperialism. Following the demise of direct colonial domination. At the same time, as imperialism finds itself in a deep crisis precipitated in part by its inability to reproduce the conditions of its stabilization. This was the point I was making around the basis of this crisis of social reproduction I was talking about. How then, this is the question posed by Marx many years ago. How then, in relation mainly to production, how do capitalist societies produce the material conditions of their reproduction? This question is core to my own inquiries here. Much of the scholarship identifies the principal contradiction of the capitalist system in the neo-colonies as being between monopoly capital and the overexploited masses of the periphery. In other words, the primary contradiction that we are dealing with in the peripheries is between workers and the oppressed masses on the one side, and on the other side, the imperialist bourgeoisie who exploit and dominate these masses. Others identify the contradiction between colonial rule and national liberation as the most basic contradiction under imperialism. Imperialist expansion of capitalist profits through the capturing of natural resources and markets is well understood, as is the idea that imperialism not only extracted and exploited resources from the global south, but has also entrenched an economic structure that creates and sustains deep inequalities in order for it to function. Furthermore, the primary contradiction between workers and the imperialist bourgeoisie feeds itself and determines the existence and development of other contradiction, such that anti-imperialist strugglers, anti-capitalists, are invariably or possibly engaged in some kind of permanent revolution. My major point around the gendered question or the feminist question in relation to imperialism, central to the structure of inequality that this kind of expansion necessitates is a system of gendered labor that is fundamental to its reproduction and sustains capitalism both in the core and the peripheries. In this regard, the literature suggests a fundamental contradiction nestled deep within the structure of accumulation, be it in relation to surplus value production or in relation to the demand for the reproduction of surplus population, surplus people. This contradiction is that capitalism draws on reproductive labor for its functioning, but does not support the reproduction of that labor. It draws on reproductive labor for its functioning, but does not support the reproduction of that labor that undertakes or takes on reproduction. This state of affairs is also indicative of a deep crisis of imperialism, as well as underlining the social dimensions of this crisis. The foregoing suggests significant limitations in thinking the structure of social reproduction that is so fundamental to capitalism in purely economic terms. Indeed, historical understanding of the nature of capitalism shows that the reality of reproduction exceeds the economic dimension alone. On a fundamental basis, because of the complexity within social reproduction itself, the question arises regarding how to stabilize a mode of production, a mode of accumulation around a factor of production, a factor that is so foundational to capitalist accumulation, over which capitalists have no direct control, or they do not invest in. That is, how does capital organize labor, which is fundamental to its stability, which it seeks to expropriate, but to whose reproduction it doesn't contribute? This complexity partially arises because the reproductive economy has historically required a higher and greater level of ideological organization in order to make it function. And here one might consider the role of patriarchal institutions, of sexism, of racism, of politicized ethnicity, which also makes it harder to define and demystify the real nature of exploitation within the sector. We exploit women's labor or gendered labor not only on the basis of gender. We can never think of gender alone. We always think of gender in its articulation to race, to ethnicity, to sexuality, and so on, which makes it a fairly complex structure. The organization of reproduction outside of capital therefore lends to capitalism itself, at least in part, its volatility and vulnerability to periodic crisis. I feel the need to say this again and again. We have a structure that, the fundamental structure in which development is proceeding in this present time, which depends to a very great extent on a structure of reproduction to reproduce the working people and surplus population, but it depends on a structure over which it has very little control and very little investment. And this is a source of profound tension and profound crisis of the capitalist system and imperialism in general. So the crisis of social reproduction that emerge periodically must as such be understood also in their social dimensions and in their political dimensions, as well as in relation, of course, to world historical changes in the structure of capitalism. Core to the argument I'm making here is that under the current conditions of global capitalism that are responsible for the massive immiseration of working people across the third world, the social reproduction of the mass of unemployed workers and waged workers takes on a different significance, as it is no longer being guaranteed by wages and income from petty commodity production alone. Rather, the social reproduction of working people depends to a great extent on a regime of gendered labor that is both productive and reproductive, as well as on the access for such labor to reproductive resources such as the commons, customary lands, and nature, as well as wages and state subsidies. We always think, when we think of social reproduction, we are always thinking of the articulation between the state, the market, and the household. State subsidies, wages, and this household, the use values that are produced in the households. The point here is to assert the contemporary significance of a gendered substratum of labor that is functioning both in central relation to capital and in spite of capital. In specific relation to land or landed resources, the persistence of the peasantry in Africa ought to be understood in concrete relation to this social reproductive imperative. Indigenous responses to capitalist monopolization of land and labor that was consolidated under the colonial reordering of lineage systems and economies highlights this necessity. So against the assertions, the prevailing, mainly global north agrarian theorizations, against the assertions that the peasantry is disappearing this the idea of a disappearing peasantry in the Global North Agrarian Scholarship. Others rather ask whether what we are witnessing is not the disappearance of the peasantry, but rather its redefinition. The argument here is that precisely due to capitalism's tendencies towards involution through its spatial concentration, the peasant form of production as operating according to a driving logic of subsistence and retaining at least some form of control over the means of production is not disappearing. Rather, it persists as rural populations are increasingly marginalized and impoverished by the currents of global capital. The persistence of peasantry is not a positive process. It stands as a testament of the failures of the development project. The survival of the continent's working people amidst massive immiseration and agrarian dispossession under capitalism cannot, in other words, be thought of apart from the landed resources that sustains lives and livelihoods in the absence of adequate wages and adequate state support, as well as the labor that is necessary to derive use values from the land, this gendered labor that I'm talking about. When considered in relation to the overall structure of social reproduction, this labor ought to be theorized concretely as gendered labor, as this neglect has tended to worsen the contradictions internal to the exploited, as well as undermining the effectiveness of social movements. So it is to this task of elaborating the nature, workings, and structure of a gendered labor regime in relation to capitalist accumulation and imperialist-induced crisis of social reproduction that I want to direct the remainder of my lecture. My aim is first to elaborate the nature of the reproductive crisis in Africa today, focusing on three main domains, major domains of class struggle. The reconstitution of gendered labor under imperialism, surplus populations and struggles over the commons, and land and agrarian reforms as a basis of social reproduction. So first, a critique of gendered labor. You let me know how much time I have. First, a critique of gendered labor under late capitalism. Capitalism reconstitutes gendered labor as a fundamental contradiction, as it congeals within it both a basis for the ideological governance and control of laboring bodies, as well as the basis of expropriation of working people. As a weapon of control, for instance, one of the primary modes through which the colonial state historically governed was on the basis of its direct and indirect actions on women's bodies through maternal health policies, population control, child vaccination, and of course, through compelling women into the biological reproduction of labor for the colonies via childbirth. As a weapon of expropriation, gendered labor again appears as the historical basis of the capitalist state, which institutionalizes the general and generational dispossession of colonized peoples in continuous cycles whose legacies linger on from slavery well into the late capitalist period. The literature is extensive on this, so I wouldn't belabor it here for the sake of time. Further implicating the ideological structure in the expansion of capitalism, different writers have shown that controlling women's sexuality, exalting maternity, and breeding a virile race of empire builders was widely perceived as the paramount means for controlling the health and wealth of the male imperial body politic, so that by the turn of the century, sexual purity emerged as a controlling metaphor for racial economic and political power. Reproductive struggles were crucial parts of the effort to gain material resources and fulfill moral imperialist ambitions. And perhaps more than any other realm of social life, reproduction demonstrates how the most intimate actions and desires of colonizing regimes are connected to debate and interventions that flow from community, colonial, and international regimes. The colonial imposition of the Western model of capitalist development on the colonies bore certain implications for newly liberated nations of the Third World. Since the progress of capitalist society was in advanced capitalist countries, progress there had been based on not only on the exploitation of free wage laborers, but fundamentally also on the exploitation of non-wage laborers, as well as plunder and colonial and neo-colonial exploitation. These were the conditions of development of the advanced capitalist countries. For developing countries, the question I'm asking here is, what does it mean for us to similarly follow that model of development? For developing nations to follow this model meant to similarly succumb to gendered labor exploitation and to entrench gender inequality in the process of accumulation. In this regard, consideration ought to be given to the ways in which gender inequalities emerge within the developmental paths being taken in Africa. And in the current phase of monopoly finance capitalism, what these inequalities mean for working people in the continent. There is a real danger of replicating unjust developmental paths, since a system of unequal exchange is entrenched under imperialism. That is, a situation in which international specialization is rooted in the unequal rates of exploitation of labor power throughout the world system. What is sufficient for this form of unequal exchange is that commodities are produced for the international market. It is, in other words, not necessary for the capitalist mode of production to dominate the different social formations in all spheres. And this reality, too, has social implications. It is not necessary. This mode of development just needs a direct intervention into the economies and does not actually need to invest in stabilizing the social and cultural domains that make even the production of raw materials in the peripheries possible. So in Samir Amin's argument, again, the area interested in the export economy has no need of the rest of the country. It has no need for the rest of the country. It is not only the productive resources of poor countries that are diverted to develop the centers of capitalism, at the same time as extroverted development is producing a large immiserated population with little recourse to the state and to national resources. It has not spared the reproductive labor whose need becomes more profound amidst such dispossession. More recently, this core-periphery articulation of gender and unequal exchange has been examined through theorizations of the flow of predominantly female caring labor from the periphery to the core of the world systems in the terms of unequal exchange. For instance, the literature shows how a particular kind of gendered labor becomes incorporated into the world capitalist system as it restructures and enters a new phase. The argument here is that the material expansion of systemic cycles of accumulation have led to intensified exploitation of female caring labor. One element of this exploitation was through, in the 90s, especially in the early 90s, was through the global integration of nursing labor, the global integration of nursing labor markets, which were conceived as part of the radical restructuring and reorganization of the financial expansion of accumulation. We saw a lot of nursing labor moving from the Philippines to Canada, for instance. This still goes on, and I think many countries, including South Africa, were part of this global incorporation of caring labor. Such incorporation of gendered labor amidst capitalist expansion is also increasingly undertaken by sub-imperialist regimes such as Saudi Arabia and others in the Gulf that heavily depend on labor importation, of domestic labor importation, and have entrenched a system of super exploitation of migrant workers. Perhaps controversially, one might also link the massive reserve of Zimbabwe's active labor force resident in South Africa today to the punitive relationship between the imperialist core that broke ranks with Zimbabwe following the radical land reform there at the turn of the century. Those reforms, as Moyo and Yeros have argued, demonstrated the fact that the third world countries do not have similar capacity as the center of the capitalist system to resolve their national questions and their agrarian questions by exporting social contradictions. That is what the advanced capitalist countries have simply done. Just export your social contradictions around labor and so on, even caste. We don't have the similar luxury. We don't have a similar luxury to export our social contradictions beyond our borders in the interest of domestic peace. So they manifest internally. Rather, under imperialism, peripheral capitalism in Zimbabwe and elsewhere has been unable to resolve the national and agrarian questions and therefore exhibit recurrent economic, social, and political crisis. The nature of the social crisis is fundamentally the inability of the labor force to reproduce itself and emanates from the fact that peripheral capitalism is in a chronic state of social crisis, evident in the statistics of high infant mortality, chronic malnutrition, vulnerability to preventable diseases, low life expectancy, and high illiteracy. The social crisis intensified in Zimbabwe under structural adjustment was exacerbated by the sanctions and has persisted in the current period of neoliberal austerity. The imposition of imperialist sanctions against the regime there had a heavy human toil, decimating the industrial, agricultural, service, and manufacturing sectors, and leading to unprecedented migration of both productive and reproductive labor. Different from the colonial period, however, contemporary labor migrants to South Africa are encountering ongoing deindustrialization and a post-apartheid regime that quite effectively foments difference as the basis of governance and labor segmentation. The result is xenophobic violence and severe fragmentation of working people, with gendered reproductive labor unsurprisingly constituting one of the most stable modes of incorporation of the informal workforce. From a third world vantage point, a critique of migrant women's labor therefore relates to the necessity of devalued gendered labor in advanced capitalist countries, it relates this need, this necessity in advanced capitalist countries to the peripheral, rendering this labor peripheral in the global south. In this regard, it is clear that gender inequality underwrites the global care chain, such that its sustenance would not be possible without intensifying the global inequality in care provision. In other words, for the advanced capitalist country to stabilize, for this kind of social stabilization, social reproduction, the condition for working people there to be able to reproduce themselves has the other side of that coin is an intensification of inequality in the peripheries that export that labor. Contemporary imperialism is also undergoing structural changes that are producing a massive surplus population to which it is unable to respond. I have taken on this question of surplus populations very much in my recent theorizations, because I think it's an issue we cannot avoid. A lot of our theorizations has been focused on the working people, on wage workers, on people who can still fundamentally reproduce themselves on the basis of some wage. But the reality is of a massive population that is being expended from the labor force every day en masse. The fact that we are not walking on the streets and stumbling over dead bodies means somebody is taking on the work and the labor of keeping these people alive when the state has abdicated this responsibility. We have to pay attention to this population. So these structural changes have been marked by a deepening systemic crisis of social reproduction. Although the crisis of social reproduction has been inherent in the whole trajectory of capitalist development, the question of social reproduction today has entered a new phase by the permanent crisis of monopoly capitalism itself. We are in a late phase of neocolonialism, where monopoly capitalism, and I'm quoting here Prasad and Yeros. We are in a late phase of neocolonialism where monopoly capitalism is unable to resolve its crisis other than by the massive expansion of labor reserves, especially in the peripheries of the world. One of the basic elements of this process is a global agrarian transition marked by rural-urban migration without commensurate industrial transition. The reality today is of a profound immiseration in which much of the peripheries, which have entered a trajectory of massive labor reserve formation, does not contain similar possibilities for the industrial absorption of labor. The majority of the population consists of non-proletarian working people who are either no longer engaged in agriculture or are spread over many occupations in urban and rural areas, including agriculture. The ensuing crisis of social reproduction is permanent to the extent that proletarianization will lag far behind the growth, the number of people entering the labor force will lag far behind the growth in the numbers of non-proletarian working people as this rural exodus continues. The intensification of rural-urban migration does not, however, necessarily suggest a process of de-agrarianization. It doesn't suggest that land or agriculture is becoming any less significant, since the evidence suggests a deepening articulation between urban and rural households through both productive and reproductive relations that are driving the demand for land. There's an example I like to give very much during COVID, during the hard lockdown, just to illustrate this link, this rural-urban link, and the link between land and agrarian labor, and gendered labor, sorry, there was a photo on the front pages of the daily newspapers in Kenya. And the photo was of a bus, a usual public transport bus that transports people, passengers. And the photo was striking and different because it was not full of people. It was full of sacks of food. Until the top, you could see the sacks of food. It was packed, and it was many buses that were moving. They were moving from rural areas to urban areas, to the major cities, Nairobi, Kisumu, and Mombasa. That food was not for sale. That food was rural families sending food to urban families who, because for the first time during the pandemic, wages were removed, especially during the hard lockdown, as a basis of reproduction for a majority of the working people. But we have to insist on this articulation, and we have to see it, and we have to frame our questions and our theorizations of land around this social reproductive question. It's much more than an asset. It's much more than, especially when we understand the concrete conditions of imperialism and capitalist development today. In the very last part of my talk, there's much more to be said on land and social reproduction. But in conclusion, I wish to conclude by reflecting briefly on the implications of the gendered structure elaborated that I've been talking about for feminist, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist struggles today. The first point relates to the extent to which the class struggle can identify the social contradictions and apprehend them. We have to, all these things I've been talking about, these sort of contradictions that are emerging in relation to the mode of development, the class struggle has to identify them and has to apprehend them. Samir Amin has shown that in advanced capitalist countries, the social formation tends to be reduced to the capitalist mode of production. The backward sectors, such as small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, are generally eliminated, and as this elimination takes place, the social democratic alliance gains strength and becomes the main enemy. In the periphery, the formal submission of other modes of production places narrow limits on the development of productive forces. The center of gravity of these struggles against capital as a class tends to shift from the center of the system to the periphery. This shift reconstitutes the working class at the periphery as the essential force of liberation, and women's struggles constitute an essential part of this liberation army. The second point relates to the political frameworks within which anti-imperialist struggles are waged. The histories of imperialism, uneven development, and ongoing processes of capitalist accumulation and dispossession have produced conditions of work and life in the global south that are so dispersed and so unorganized as to require different epistemological and methodological approaches to make sense of them. The task of accounting for the full range of social realities in the global south therefore entails adopting a more critical vantage point that frames the phenomena we valorize, the data we gather, and the political significance which we attach to that data. In other words, such theorizing is marked on all sides by a political imperative, which, as I have tried to show, must include the liberation of the gendered commons. When I talk of the gendered commons, I'm not just talking about land and nature, I'm also talking about the labor that, that transforms those resources into use value. It also entails developing theories that are grounded in the material analysis of existing social, radical social forces. We have to know who we can work with. We have to know, what we can influence, whether it's in the domain of policy, of theorization, and activism. And we also have to develop theories that pay attention to the nuances of national specificities. There's no monolithic Africa that we can understand in some universalist sense. We have to pay attention to the specificities of context and history. Lastly and relatedly, the question of agrarian sovereignty, which I have sought to emphasize in the final sections of the text, leads me conclusively to the question of national sovereignty and national liberation as the fundamental conditions for safeguarding the possibility of survival for most of the world. A critical body of third world agrarian literature has been fundamental in elaborating the necessity of identifying the political subject of the agrarian question. Who is the subject of our analysis? I ask my students all the time that you have to, we can't afford to think around some abstract subjects. We have to very concretely identify, who am I dragging to my grave? Mine has been the peasantry, it has been gendered labor in general. We have to identify the subject of our theorizations, which brings clarity to our analysis. So in this, we are also asserting the indispensability of a gendered analytical lens if the national liberation project is to concretely take on the structure of imperialism. To quote Moyo Yero Sanja, my good comrades, the consolidation of monopoly finance capital and the new scramble for monopoly control over the planet's natural resources and agricultural land have constituted a concerted attempt to reverse the gains of national liberation. The challenge in the current phase is therefore qualitatively different. The key issue is no longer the conquest of political sovereignty. We have done that. In a generalized sense, although colonial questions do persist and are ever expanding, that question of political sovereignty has found significant expression. Rather, the defense and the deepening of the already conquered sovereignty regime is what is sitting with us. Today, this defense of what we've already conquered, the sovereignty regime that has already been conquered, this would be impossible without a gendered understanding of the agrarian question, of enforcement of the differential ecological rights and obligations pertaining to the North and South, or regional pooling of sovereignty and coordinated agro-industrial integration. So, neither the consideration of the sovereignty of lands, nor of nations, nor of food systems or nature, or in that case, any possibility for a genuine liberation project of the third world can proceed without a serious consideration of the gendered labor regimes that remain trapped under the immiserating weight of capitalist accumulation centuries into their captivity. The anti-imperialist wars we continue to wage do not constitute any meaningful path, I'm afraid, to the third world liberation if they do not retain a focus on this materialist, feminist histories. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Prof. OSSOME, for that thought-provoking reflection and analysis on the topic of on agrarian reform, social reproduction, and gender. Colleagues, I'm just going to take first comments and then questions. We are not going to have a respondent to this paper, which is okay, because no one said that every lecture must have a respondent. So we are just starting something new today. So this will give us enough time, or more time, to reflect, ask questions, and comment on what Professor OSSOME has just shared with us. Is there anyone who's taking the first to make a comment? I see Kosi Mklatsi.
No, thank you for a very engaging talk. One of the things I was missing from the discussion was questions of agency and how this agency would be understood, because here there's discussions on labor inequality, how certain labor requires women's bodies, and what I'm not hearing is how can we, in our drive to maybe I wouldn't even use the word equality, but our drive for agency and being able to talk about our own bodies, a lot of this requires the use of other women's bodies. Me being middle class, wanting the life of an academic, means that someone must stay at home and take on that labor. What about that person who's taking on that labor? Will their dreams be limited to this way? Especially since you speak of this class analysis, I'd be interested if you would speak on what this class analysis entails, because I'm so much of it, it just seems within the system, it's just exploitation top down, to the point where even our most radical theories in itself hide this exploitation. And I'd like to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, Prof. Grace.
Dumela colleagues.
Good.
It's difficult to just comment and not ask a question.
You can do both.
Thank you. Firstly, I just want to say thanks to Professor OSSOME. I think the lecture was amazing, and I really loved the connections that she made for us. I was fascinated by the example of, I mean, you would never think about that, of a bus moving from the rural to the city to support people in the city. Because usually it's the other way around, where wages is sent from the city to the rural. I am fascinated by that because we are now sitting in a context of 4IR, where unemployment is going up because factories are closing down, and we are seeing a growth of what some authors call techno-feudalism, where we pay rent. You pay rent to Google so that you have more space, So we are seeing a growth of that, and we are seeing less and less people having factory jobs, earning income from labor, as we know labor. So we are seeing a change in labor politics. So my question is to Professor OSSOME is in the context of the 4IR, which is I think a great concern for for many of us is how do we think about this reproductive crisis in this particular context? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Kuno. Can I take the third one before I ask Prof. OSSOME to respond or to comment? Is there anyone? Prof. Maseng?
Thank you very much, Prof. OSSOME, for your very detailed, engaging, informative lecture. My question is a bit controversial. Listening at you, it seems the main perpetrator is out there. Who is the perpetrator of all this? From your talk, it seems the perpetrator is the historically powerful, the North, and perhaps the former colonizers and so forth. And let me quickly bring it home by the example you gave about, about Zimbabwe and, the xenophobic attacks and so forth from South Africa, a reaction and so forth, and say, I sort of kind of was able to figure that also out there, to say who is the perpetrator of all this. And then I can't leave out patriarchy, and patriarchy in the house, on the continent, and here in South Africa, for example. The reason why I asked that kind of, would it be rhetorical also, or who is the perpetrator? And I'm not trying to defend the North or the previously, our former colonizers and all that, but I'm wondering what role are we doing, or our leaders doing, in solving, somebody brought in the question of agency. And ultimately, if we keep on, I sat on a Sunday listening to a pastor saying, let's stop blaming, in the context of South Africa, let's stop blaming apartheid. What is happening within the continent in terms of the political, leadership and the perpetration of what has been happening from outside to us? And what is the role of patriarchy in all of this, for example, in our immediate various African contexts? And then lastly, the issue of ecology. I was fascinated when you brought in ecology right at the end, and would have laughed in terms of how, as human beings, we continue, and of course, mainly human beings of power, continue to push aside earth or nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Masenya. I'm going to allow Prof. OSSOME to respond. Prof, do you mind moving to this side, because colleagues, we just saw furniture moving in. So people from that side, they can't see Prof. OSSOME. So I'll ask her to come and respond from this podium. Thank you.
Thank you for these really important questions. One, on the question of agency, I think it's always a double-edged sword. And I think what feminist analysis has done for structural analysis, what postcolonial analysis generally, where we have to take seriously questions of difference, is that we absolutely insist that you can't pay attention. It can't be just a focus on, and maybe I think I start to answer the other question also on the perpetrator. If it's a double-edged sword, because if we take the question of agency, we can say this: women have agency and gendered labor has agency. What is the limit of that agency when we have a structure? What I've been trying to argue is that the condition for capitalist development is this substratum of labor, of gendered labor, that, and as you're rightly saying, It's not just the condition for that woman in the global north to go to work, which depends on the importation of nurses from Philippines or domestic workers from East Africa. It is also for us as middle-class women in the continent, for us to get some education or to work, there has to be some other woman. Social reproduction is fundamentally a critique of capitalism. And what I am saying is not, there's nothing positive about this process. It's a critique. The fact that you have a system that has to reproduce itself on this basis. And so we have to be very worried when we hear, the UN has taken it up. The World Bank has taken it up. When the World Bank takes on, it doesn't really say social reproduction, they talk about care, because it's easy to talk about care. When you talk about a care economy, most of it doesn't deal with the structure itself of production and reproduction. But they've taken it on. What does it mean for the major sponsors of austerity and neoliberal capitalism to be taking on this concept and saying we have to make these economies more caring? What does it mean? So it's a critique in the sense that it's a basis of inequality, and we have to pay attention to it. And there's no kind of class struggle that is going to actually get us to where we want to go if we're not paying attention to this inequality. It's a domain that is neglected. Even childbirth is thought of as just things women are supposed to do. So I'm not dismissive of agency. I'm thinking about agency very much in relation to a structure of accumulation, and I'm thinking very much about, I'll give you another example. Look at the question of sexual violence, rape in South Africa. The predominant response of the feminist movements has been to call on the state, rightly. We want more security. We want a more, whether it's police, we want a judicial system that is more active, but especially in relation to police. The agency, the agentic factor is that feminists have been able to articulate and make these claims on the state. The other side of it is that what we are actually, the risk we run into is strengthening a police state, right? So there's a structure that even activism or class struggle can perpetuate if we're not paying attention. So mine is to say, look at both sides. Pay attention to structure. Class analysis became very unfashionable in the 90s. We have to go back to it. We have to take seriously the structure and the economies in which we are thinking about development. Thank you, Grace, for this question. I don't think we can run away from technology. I've been sitting with a friend of mine who is, whose mind thinks in interesting ways over the weekend. And, for the first time, this is a black woman who managed to convince me and tell me, she was showing me some things that they do now with artificial intelligence, which I have not thought of. I felt like I was coming from another century. So it's there, and it's allowing people to do many more things. It's cutting the amount of labor. But the real, when we take seriously the material condition of the fourth industrial revolution, is that it is going to produce a massive reserve of labor. The Patnaiks say this army is not even a reserve army anymore. We used to think about an army because they are always on the periphery. Sometimes they are brought in when there is high production. Sometimes they are kicked out. What we are sitting with actually is just a labor reserve, especially in the global south. People who are not, capital no longer needs that much labor. You know, we are actively deindustrializing, manufacturing is not growing. Why are we focusing so much energy on a realm that is, whose articulation is mostly with the state and a very specialized sector of the economy? I'm not saying stop the AI and technology, but we have to pay attention to there has to be, our economies have to develop on the basis of strengthening the productive sectors. Otherwise, we are sitting with this massive amount. Many of us have siblings in their 40s, 30s, 40s who are sitting at home. It's a reality everywhere. When we look at what is happening in Kenya today, it is, you know, the protests that have been happening are really around that. It's a massive population of young people who are very smart and very well educated and who are actually technologically very savvy. But they see the real threat. You know, when you're trying to impose taxes that are not just going to take away the incomes of the people who are reproducing them, but also the land and the basis of their survival, then we are going to see this kind of thing. So, yes, my answer to this, you know, when we take seriously context, you know, much of Africa is still actually very agrarian, very dependent on land. When we look at how countries like Ethiopia, for example, survived during COVID, is because 80% of its population anyway depends on a subsistence economy. You know, in many places, when we presume a large proletarianized workforce who are cut off from the land and who are cut off from access, then we are dealing with a very serious political question. It's not just an economic problem, it's a social and political question. The question of the main, who is the main perpetrator? I mean, to be fair, you know, we can, again, if we sit and say, I mean, of course, African governments are not innocent. They're not innocent. But again, look at what is happening in much of the continent with some terms of democratic or political competitions, elections. What we are seeing in many of our countries, at least Kenya is one of them. We've seen it maybe in Zambia and all. We are seeing a kind of move towards regime change. We are seeing this protest, and which in Kenya, which was sparked by this very punitive tax proposals, are very classically of the IMF, from the IMF playbook. Young people can see it. You're not going to, so we are installing regimes that are compliant, that are doing the bidding not of the people, but of global capital. It doesn't excuse there's massive corruption, of course, in our governments. There are massive ways in which the political class continues to manufacture difference as the basis of governance. You know, how do we stabilize working people who we cannot reproduce and who we cannot pay sufficiently? So you fragment very much in the colonial mode, you fragment working people internally. That is there, but I think there's nothing we can understand really about the sort of political decisions, what are being prioritized in our countries, if we don't take seriously the change in the structure of capitalism itself. This contemporary, where we are sitting with monopoly finance capital, which is highly speculative, which actually doesn't need any expanding kind of labor force. We have a massive surplus, which capitalism doesn't need, it doesn't care for, and it doesn't have to reproduce. Those have to be the questions we're asking our governments. Instead of sitting and sympathizing with our governments, they have not given us a basis for our sympathy. So it's not to dismiss, again, the agency of the postcolonial elite and the governments, but it is to say that even that critique has to be subjected to a broader framework of accumulation and what it does, both in the advanced capitalist countries and in our countries on the continent.
Thank you, Prof. OSSOME. I have noted Dr. Sitati Motebang and my brother there. Is that Paseka? Paseka and, my brother there, in that order. Prof. Dr. Motebang, my brother, Paseka, and the colleagues there. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Prof, and for your presentation. And I must say that when I was doing research on the care economy 2 years ago, I was commissioned by the ECA in Ethiopia to do a comparative study on the African continent on the impact of COVID-19 on the care economy. And one of the articles that, for some reason, I just landed on was your article on how the care economy itself is, to a great extent, also another elaboration of the social reproduction that is very much entrenched on women's labor, undervalued when it's paid or unpaid altogether. And so my question is, I was looking forward to us further unpacking the structure of the household, like what Prof was saying there, to say, is the enemy or the cause entirely out there? To what extent have we looked at the internal functionings of our society? A long time ago, female-headed households were quite the top priority whenever we talked about genderized labor. To say, as capitalism and imperialism are in crisis, to what extent has that created opportunities for female-headed households, especially those that have women that have the skills and have invested in education, etc. But also to say, can we further look at the role of marriage and patriarchy in the further exploitation of women, either for their for unpaid labor as housewives, but also on the other hand, while expecting them now to also be market, what can I say, useful to the market. It's no longer good enough to have a wife that can keep a house clean and warm and everything, but when it comes to Buhadi negotiations, it adds value that our daughter has a degree and therefore is going to provide a lot more than just the basic social conditions that were expected. And I don't hear that enough as to say, is it just about the state and capitalism, but what extent is also our culture and the continued exploitation of women within the household? The second one has to do with policy. To say that a policy, we reached a stage in the African context, economics, development studies context, where we're talking about gender-based reporting, budgeting, as a way of redirecting resources properly. And that could only happen if you dissect to the minutest, lowest level what is happening in those households, who is using water, who owns the rights to water, who is You know, how do we have, for example, South Africa, an economy that has agriculture that supports the rest of the continent and the world commercially, but you have about 40% of people going home to sleep hungry. To say, if you were serious or well-intended about focusing on dissecting what is happening in the household, who owns what, who controls what, and how does the state, as a way of channeling the resources, then become the agent that focuses on how you deconstruct that exploitation. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Prof. Lynn, for the talk. I think mine is actually very simple, or rather straightforward. I'm actually fascinated about how you possibly think about the idea of liberatory, emancipatory kind of work and mechanisms as underpinned or underwritten by the very notion of gendered labor. And you actually spoke about how to complicate the very nature or the very work of trying to get being away or running away from the idea of contradictory kind of or weaponization of these of people's experiences who are actually marginalized or rather in the periphery, and actually exploiting those for them to be utilized by the global north. For example, the idea of care labor is one of them, where we try to bring about this very understandings to the people and the marginal to say, okay, now we redirect from this capitalistic version of how to think of labor, and we actually move into a very notion of care to try bring about this brainwashing, I suppose. And I'm just trying to think about then these kind of alternations or forging newer spaces or livable rather spaces of how to think about and how this kind of feministic or feminism work has possibly corpus of work has rather thought about the newer kind of spaces of thinking about gendered labor as that which could possibly think about the newer ways of being, the newer ways of livabilities, the newer ways of forging spaces that enable these narratives that have actually been marginalized to actually be revitalized and thought about anew, or rather from a different spectacle altogether.
Thank you, Prof. I just wanted to quickly touch on, it's more of a comment than a question, on the fourth industrial revolution and how we see it. I understand within the context of Africa, thinking about the fourth industrial revolution is difficult, especially considering the fact that a high percentage of the population of the continent is yet to even be able to function with the tools which were supplied by the third industrial revolution. So now I think about things like AI, robotics, the Internet of Things, blockchain and whatnot. It becomes a bit more complex to be able to apply those in the context of the continent. So that is the context of where I understand the criticism. But I have come to a point where I think our criticism comes from a place of us not willing to engage with it enough, to a point where we should see it as a liberator, especially for those who have been bordered or have been chained by previous modes of work, ways of work, and the life of work. So in me saying it in this context, I'm trying to say that I'm seeing it from the perspective of gender, that those who had been held back by what we had regarded as gender stereotypes in workplaces, where you would anticipate specific genders to participate in its majority, can now be able to work in spaces that would be presented by this industrial revolution. So I think we should look at it from that point of view and look at it as a liberator, and our and our criticism of it should not be of us to dismiss it, because the reality is that we will have to engage with it, especially if we can teach our students in the context of universities to function within it. I hope that that makes sense. Thank you, Prof.
Oh, thank you very much. It's the last one. Sorry. Yeah, Prof. Oh, so I would like also to ask in regards with the issue now. Are we going to point guard in terms of how we measure equality versus inclusivity? Yeah, we see with the current appointment of the Judge Magdisamaya, we hope that balances. But if we also we try to measure, so with the attempted assassination of the advocate of SARS, who is currently investigating, I think, short mom keys or something. So are we saying if also we measure in inclusivity or equality, are we putting women in harm's way for them to go and dig the gems? Yeah, for instance, we also saw the issue of posting firefighters, women. I think it's 5 of them who perished with fire, I think in KZN. So in those kind of situations, are we saying that if we're measuring equality or inclusivity, some other instance, could we be putting the gender issue to harm's way? So, and this other guy, Elon Musk, the issue that is also was trending last week, pulling out from California because California is introducing the law of people can change their gender, transform their gender without the consent of the parents. So that also the policy issue includes for, do we also, from household policy issue vis-a-vis the state policy measurement. And also continue to say, Melinda Gates, French, for them endorsing Biden, they're collapsing the Western colonization, Western modernity or something. Yeah, could also American audience highlight on that? The other issue was the gross education monitoring system versus the gross employment monitoring system, the GEMS. So now if we find we're from the Freedom Park dog watch, Estate SA, if the public office is offering male condoms in toilets vis-a-vis failing to enforce the law to offer sanitary pads in public schools. So also how are we going to match or point guard, inclusivity and equality, in that regard. Thank you very much. Sorry for the fiction book. It's 46 million now.
Thank you for this question. The last gentleman, I mean, it was a long question, but in a sense, my understanding is that there's something also contradictory in how we incorporate women into, the question of equality. I imagine that's what you're driving at. What does it mean to have more lawyers when they're vulnerable in those ways, to have more women firefighters and they face danger? I mean, these occupations, the occupations are dangerous anyway, right? It's dangerous, not because law is dangerous to be a lawyer, but it's dangerous because you're practicing it in a context that is fundamentally unsafe, politically, in whatever ways. There are many there are things that kill women much more than that. Childbirth still kills more than 40% of women across the continent. It could be higher in some places. There are more dangerous things that kill women everywhere. The question, the gentleman, sorry I didn't get the name, on the 4IR. It's a controversial claim that it could be a liberator, and it could in another context. You know, in places like China, for instance, I was watching a video. I don't know if it's AI generated. That's what we don't know anymore, right? We don't know what we are watching. But of a self-driven car and a child who is maybe 6 or 7 ordering an Uber that is self-driven and gets to where they're going safer, and they put in a code as what opens the car. You know, this is the time of someone who would have had to take her wherever she was going and be worried the whole time about safety of the child, right? So there are possibilities like that, but I think it also depends on a context. You know, the reality is that there is actually no reproductive function that is performed, you know, by women that does not have a market substitute already. Whether you're thinking of breastfeeding, whether it is childbirth itself, there are so many things that we thought only women could do that actually now you can buy in the market. The condition is that you have to have the money to buy it, right? The AI is not going to come at no cost. In societies that I think are relatively more advanced or developed, it might be a good thing. I don't think there's any running away from it. I mean, anyone who has been to China must know that this is not something we can. Chinese society is something else. Africa is maybe 50 years behind what China is doing right now. But we have to, I think the problem is that even with those market substitutes, even if you can buy breast milk or a uterus or whatever, it hasn't freed women from these historical reproductive roles. And I think the reason could be around the question you're asking, and you are asking around patriarchy, right? There's also a cultural basis for social reproduction. It's not just about the market. It's not just about pulling women's bodies into the market. We have to think about what disciplines that labor. What makes us go into the domain of exploitative work, as the young lady who asked the question first. What makes us go in every day, even though it is back-breaking and exploitative and it's very poorly paying, and then we come back home and we are doing a similar kind of work. There has to be, we have to also take seriously the cultural, the structure itself is not just an economic structure. It is also deeply embedded in a cultural and patriarchal structure that constantly disciplines this labor and invokes the language of culture to get us to go and be good wives and daughters and whatever, even labor, even in the workplace. It's not just in the household. The university, many women will tell you, it comes a time when we feel like we are part of the furniture and the plants and what, because of the reproductive labor that you don't just do, sometimes you think willingly, it's expected of you, it's part of what is written into your job, which you don't even see, but you're always doing it. On the liberatory work, the liberatory question, there's an interesting article by Diane Elson. It's called Holding Hands at Midnight. And she talks about love, right? I mean, love, anyway, affect is the basis of, it's a fundamental basis of care labor. People don't just do care labor because we are producing capital. We care about our parents and our siblings and our children because we actually care about them, because we love them. it is, but it has been appropriated, and affect is commodified in all these ways. Of course, we can't think of better ways. So we have to be in community. And sometimes I'm afraid that these critiques of social reproduction and care might lead us to a place where we are not saying withdraw that. In any case, we can't, no society can survive without some kind of structure of reproduction, of care in these ways. We have to think about the exploitative structure of it. There's nothing you can, and why I keep talking about the contradictions and gender inequality itself as a contradiction is that even, imagine you build a utopia, a commune, you know, in the way that was popular in the 60s and so on. Some people are still imagining them, and you bring all of us together, and you tell us the declaration is that all of you in here have rights, right? Have similar rights. We are all equal in here. But the condition of you being in here is you come in fundamentally just as a human being. You know, it's your humanity that we see. What is the condition of appearing only as a human being? And here I'm also critiquing the human rights canon. Is that, you know, the colonized are invited in the post-colonial period, were invited and told, you can all partake in this festival. We are all equal now. You are independent and what? The condition is you have to leave your identity behind. Here you are not an ethnic, we don't care about your ethnicity or your gender or your race or your sexuality. Here you're just human. But remember, we don't choose to be gendered. We don't choose, you know, gender on itself is benign. Sexuality on itself is benign. It doesn't mean anything. To say I am a lesbian or a gay man, it doesn't mean anything. To say I am a Kenyan of a certain ethnicity, it becomes potent when it becomes an instrument of control and of domination and of exploitation. That's why we worry about it. The colonial political economy, remember, the colonial state, you know, its fundamental problem, the native question, was how do we govern this mass of natives? Well, how does a small minority govern a mass, right? So the question of difference was fundamental to it because you have to fragment, collect a mass consciousness. So class, gender. In my own work, I've written about how gender and ethnicity maps onto the bodies of certain women, right, as a mode of control. And the legacy is into the post-colonial state. So in the question again around who is the perpetrator, it is that we are sitting with the legacies of the structures of capitalist development and the legacies of political governance. So back to the room, you're told you can come in but leave those things outside. Here we are, but the reality is that you're not. The reality is that those things determine how you see each other and how you relate. So inside that room, there has to be, we have to continue to expose these questions of difference in our own house, not just in relation to imperialism and the global political economy, but also in the continent. We have to think about the basis of difference and conflict between us. Thank you for these really good questions on the care economy. I'd love to read the study that you did, the comparative study. I mean, I agree. We need to pay attention to the internal, I mean, absolutely. The sort of microeconomy has to be a basis of this. It's not just about capital and the state. And as I was saying, this, you know, marriage and all that, the patriarchy structure internal relations, the structure who works, who gets to get what, how resources are divided. But when we look at, for instance, assuming the notion of the female-headed households that has been, such a prominent lens in gender analysis of economies, when we look at the migration of domestic labor now, which is very, it's happening at a very high rate in Uganda, where I live, and Kenya, where I come from. In the airport now, if you go to the airport, there's always a long line of young girls, wearing T-shirts. It's being done through agents, and actually these governments have signed formal agreements with the governments in the Gulf. They're predominantly women. I've not seen men in those lines, right? The interesting thing for me is that a lot of them seem to be coming from rural areas. They're not urban. You can see it in the, you can tell. But you can also, when you talk to them. So it means that there is a huge shift, this gendered labor, women's labor is being moved, out of these economies. So even if we are thinking about the household, again, we can't understand this migrant labor regime if we don't understand the sort of structural push, that if we don't understand those economies that are reproducing them. So the point I'm trying to make is there's no escaping that. I don't think there's much we can understand about. So most of those households, we would find that it's actually predominated by male labor now, right? Which is still gendered labor, but it's men. And so we nuance our analysis in that regard, but we can't understand why women, why a particular class of women, why rural women, why not urban women? Those are questions we have to ask. So I absolutely agree, and I think the micro-studies have been very important, especially in refining the data that we need, which we then, it's the absolute, I think, starting point to collect this kind of concrete data, which we can then abstract as we try to understand the overall structure. Yeah.
I'm going to take the last round of questions, if there's any. And Veli, are there any comments? No comments. There's a hand up there, and I see, is that Usman there? There's a second one. 3.
Thank you so much. I'm Ilana. I'm from UP. I just wanted to ask a question about your use of feminist theory. Specifically, I want to know about, since we know there are feminisms, and you didn't say much about what type of feminism you are using, and I think the danger of that being, or what your understanding of feminism is, what the particularity of this feminism is, given the fact that feminism in its broadest sense, as it was used in your presentation, is itself an imperial invention. And then that just reproducing perhaps the contradictions you mentioned. Especially if we consider that when we're talking about gendered labor, that finds its roots in second wave feminism, and that being purely an argument, or at its core being an argument to participate in imperial structures, or a fight to participate in those structures. So I want to just perhaps, or I'm asking for you to perhaps elaborate a bit more, and perhaps to talk about the dangers of that broad use. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor OSSOME, for a very interesting and thought-provoking lecture, of course, it raises a number of questions that may not necessarily be responded to at this point, but I want to believe and understand that the nature of Africa Speaks as it is not just to have once-off questions and answers, but ongoing debate and interactions and interrogations of these issues. Mine has to do with the building of nation states on the continent. And this is within the context of the movement of labor to where capital resides. And it's becoming very clear that our continent, capital doesn't reside here. And if our most potent part of the population is going to live and reside where capital itself resides, where does it live? The notion of nation building, and I know this concept of nation building was for a long time some kind of a swear word or swear concept in some areas, but we find the need. We find the need for that, or is it something that has to be relegated to the periphery? But if we are saying that, why or how can we continue talking about Africa as a relevant continent? It's something that needs to be to grow and be grown. You just gave a comparison between Africa and China, to say that Africa as a continent cannot compare with the country China. So if we forever are going to where capital resides and we do not produce capital here, what does it say about our future as a continent and as a people? Thank you.
Thank you very much. During the talk, you note, and I think it's very helpful, note about the exploitation of contradictions from the sort of capital north to the agrarian south. And I think I find it useful also to think in terms of exploitation of the impacts of consumption and accumulation, also along the same lines, in a sort of the metabolic rift that characterizes a lot of capitalist society, tendency to convert a sort of environmental use value into irreclaimable waste products, which then those are amongst the impacts that then get shifted into these agrarian settings, into sacrifice zones quite often. Like in South Africa, we have our own examples. Mpumalanga is really quite scarred by its association with Eskom, for instance. And it's a significant, the power goes upstream, but what's in the area is quite brutalized by the industry that powers it. And so, looking at a more macro scale, sort of this increasing crisis of climate change, for instance, compounding crises of social reproduction, and then with those impacts falling predominantly in the south. So do you see a sort of space, I think, for like a kind of liberational environmentalism in parallel to our assessments of gender, sort of decommodification of ecology potentially being a inflection point or an interest point alongside gendered labor, materialist assessment? Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. I'll start with the last question. You're absolutely right in terms of the ways in which capital exports the impacts of this mode of accumulation and of production. The ecological question is to me a complex one, right? Because we've seen, say here, where in South Africa, where there's a lot of talk now on green energy, what is the framework? Just transition. You know, what does development look like? You know, we have to really pay attention about who our people are. I talk about Museveni a lot, the president of Uganda, who, you know, we can say a lot of things about him, about being in power for too long. We were counting today, it's been, you know, since 1986 and so on. But I've always had a sense, and in this regard I'm very partial, that this is somebody who understands who his people are. Uganda is the one probably African country, not Kenya, not anywhere else, where shops, many shops, and I'm not talking of just supermarkets, I'm talking about small spaza shops and shops selling electronics and a woman selling gonja on the streets 24/7, 24 hours a day. It's open. Small traders. It's a country of small traders, and it's a country of farmers. There's a large peasantry in Uganda. There's a market, a very big market called Nakasero Market. It operates 24 hours a day. Do you know who populates those markets? It is women. The whole night, there are buses bringing food from rural areas, whether it is sweet potato or Irish, whatever food, it's brought to be sold. Now, no rational person is going to stay and open their spaza shop at midnight when they feel unsafe. So the fundamental discourse in Uganda is, oh, it's highly militarized. You will see the military everywhere. I feel more afraid when I see police in Kenya than when I see these trucks. They are not trying to attack the people who, in a general sense, I mean, we could analyze that. It's a different thing. In a general sense, to me, it means that people feel safe enough to open. It's not just traders, it's young men playing basketball until 2 a.m. It's people playing soccer until God knows when, right? So, and the agrarian thing, he also understands that if we don't open up the markets and allow these markets to trade 24 hours, food is going to go bad in the farm. So this is somebody who, in my view, you can criticize him on many grounds, but I think on the basis that he seems to understand who his people are. They are farmers, and then it's 80% an informal economy. Now, the problem with many of our nations is that we are running them based on an impression of an economy somewhere else, right? We have a government in Kenya that is trying to tax us out of our, through its teeth. It wants all the money. It imagines that everybody is earning a wage income. We are not. We are also largely agrarian. There's a huge informal economy. Now, if you understand that your country is agrarian, for example, people depend on land, people depend on energy that is not from the main grid, right? People need firewood to light fire. People need to forage to get food. Then we start pushing for, let us build these power stations that save energy and the environment, and they reduce carbon. Again, another discussion. We really, climate change, I think, is something we should take seriously. But the disposition is that even as we push for this kind of more green economies, if we are not taking seriously the ways in which people survive and make a living, then we are going to have a development that is very elite-oriented, that doesn't actually resolve the developmental problems of a context. This is also with the question of IR that I wanted to say earlier. It might not be bad, but it should articulate to the productive and the reproductive sectors. So there, I have a complicated relationship with the ecological questions. We have to deal with them, but we have, at least in the third world, we have many communities that, I mean, think of indigenous communities, but even here in South Africa, you're pushing people people out who already do not have work, as you're, I think, rightly saying. So we need governments. That's our work as part of the intelligentsia and intellectuals in the university, is to expose the actual ways in which people survive in these countries. On the question about building, the nation building, and the fact that capital, of course, I mean, I agree. In many ways, capital does not reside here. A lot of it is going towards, is being repatriated where capital sits at the core of empire itself. Do we develop our nations if we stop the movement of people? The movement of people is as old as time, and I don't think the problem is that people are moving. The problem, I think the struggle is internal. You know, there's an internal struggle about, why is it so easy for labor to make its way out? Why, labor is being expended en masse. People are going to look for survival. People are going to migrate for different reasons. So, I mean, I think in terms of, in my talk, I talked about national liberation and national sovereignty. A good friend of ours, he was the Secretary General of the Pan-Africanist movement, the late Tajuddin Abdul Rahim. Taju used to make a joke, and he used to say, he was looking at this exodus that started in the 2000s, which resumed. And he used to say that the tragedy about Africa today is that if a slave ship docked in the coast of Mombasa, there would be a line, almost 700 kilometers of people waiting to enter that slave ship, right? It's a tragedy, and we can talk about it as Pan-Africanists, as people who care about the continent. It's one thing to say that. Who is to blame? We are living in countries that are in many ways unlivable for many people. We are not investing in the productive sector. So a lot of the burden of even reproducing those who are kicked out of the productive sector of industry and those who are in it are being transferred to a reproductive sector. So my whole point has been that we have to be paying attention to this realm of who is reproducing the people in the absence of the state, in the absence of the market of jobs, in the absence of, even land is being taken away. There's all these people, Dubai and others who are buying just thousands of acres of land to reproduce their own people. And it displaces people in the continent and it reproduces their own people. We have to think about, we don't all want title deeds just to say I own this piece of land. We want land because we recognize that it's actually it's a fundamental basis of our struggle, especially in countries where it retains such relevance for the survival of the people. So I think in many ways, I think we have to direct our lenses internally. The national liberation question is also it's an intense struggle between the social forces in the country itself. On the question of feminist theory, I mean, I'm thinking very much within feminist political economy. Feminism for me is not, it's interesting that you talk about second wave feminism, probably, which has talked about this, the body and the weight is interpolated and drawn in and exploited and all this. I think the important point is, for me, if we think of feminism, it's not an identity. It is a feminist theory is a system of knowledge. If you take it as an epistemological approach, it allows me to look at certain things. A radical feminist might not be too concerned about the productive sectors of the economy, might not be too concerned about a conceptualization. It's one thing to think about a gendered body. It's another thing to think about that body as a laboring body. So I think it's concept that matters. Feminist theory, any theory that shows you these are the things you have to pay attention to. In political economy, I have to take seriously the articulation between the state and the market and the household. That is where I draw my sort of empirical. That's my empirical base. Another form of feminism, a liberal feminist, and we stand accused many times when we talk like this, and the liberal feminists will say, we are too dismissive of questions of representation. We are not. I would take seriously, as a political economist, I would want representation, but I would take seriously the nature of the state into which we are seeking. Structure matters. So I think it's, I think one should choose kind of whatever feminist theory they want. The point is, what is the object of your analysis? That has to be the starting point. It can't be, a theory does not follow the object. The object defines the theory, the theoretical approach. And so in this work, I'm sitting very much in a kind of historical materialist analysis, subject of a longer discussion.
Colleagues, I'm just sitting there and I'm seeing people pointing their fingers like this, like, recognize me, recognize me. But I'm just going to take the last round of questions. Last. Ms. Baloyi. And Zeni. Okay, you'll be the only one to speak. And the last one.
Working?
But your voice is a speaker.
Oh. Okay. My speakers seem not to be working, then they have borrowed me. I think I'm just sitting here and I felt, on the lighter note, I want to say to Prof, thank you for making us to know that we are all perpetrators here. Because he said who's the perpetrator, so I choose to just say we are all perpetrators. And what I'm taking also is to say, as we are perpetrators, we just have to be cautioned somehow to be getting to be better perpetrators tomorrow of losing our control and losing our hunger to be perpetuating inequality and everything that makes us to feel very much in control. And maybe on the lighter note also, I want to say, can we just also continue to embrace to be an African child? I'm an African child and much more. I was born in Africa. I was born by an African family, by an African mother. My father was an African man with a human soul. My body and spirit was nurtured in Africa with African identity, yet I am more than an African child in stature and pride. I am an African child with humility and obedience. In obedience and honor I was raised. I am an African child who grew beyond the South African borders and boundaries. I am an African child and much more than an African child. My mother spoke more than the African languages. My mother spoke more than the life languages of Africa. My mother spoke love into my African ears. I heard beyond all my mother's nurturing tongues. I spoke beyond when I spoke beyond the languages which only a mother could utter. I spoke all the life-giving languages in order to live. I arrived beyond the rivers of Africa. I climbed beyond all mountains of African continents. I climbed all the hills of the created hillocks in search of my African soil. Yet, every time I stepped on the land, I possessed without limit. My heart sang melodies of life beyond the African rhythm. I had all the life blues beyond African blues dances. I cried many tears beyond the African pain and sorrows. I cried beyond the borders and across the borders. Yet my tears brought me life beyond my African life. I lived like an African child. I walked and thought like a human being without measure. I lived and moved yesterday. I had my being yesterday. I still have my being today. All I ever had was my being in the one who gave me more than an African look. I am an African child, and I am much more than an African child outside the globe. I am an African child and much more. I am an African child with a globe in my hand. How do I see darkness when my light is in my hand? I am not part of the globe. I am the globe. Light is my globe light is beyond the globe. For me, the globe to lighten up. I am an African child and much more than African child. I am an African child who owns the globe. I am an African child with the light of the globe. I am an African child with a mind of no continents and boundaries. I am an African child with the spirit of an African being and much more. I am an African child and much more. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Believe me when I say to you, she wrote that while she was sitting there while Professor OSSOME was presenting. And then if maybe I didn't give her a chance, I was going to be in trouble. She was going to write to me a long email like she did this morning at 2 a.m. asking me about Africa Speaks. She doesn't want to see me online. Thank you so much, Tebza, for that beautiful poem. Professor OSSOME, your reaction on that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It's meaningful to hear this poetry anywhere in Africa. It's particularly meaningful to hear them in South Africa, for reasons I will not say. But thank you. I'm always thinking, and I think these questions of sovereignty, these questions of liberation, cannot come from a vacuum. Their absolute starting point has to be a reflection on who are we? Who are we as South Africans or as Senegalese or whatever, and what does it mean to be part of a larger collective called Africa? That we have to have an absolute conviction around who we are, which is what makes the defense of anything that we have managed to win so far worthwhile. Because the struggle, I think we're in a state of permanent revolution. So continuously reminding ourselves through poetry, which is, as the feminists here would know, is a revolutionary tool. It's a tool that has to remain at our disposal. So thank you very much, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Prof. OSSOME, for those closing remarks. I'm just going to say the last 2-3 things before I sit down. You won't see me again back here or my voice except outside. Before I call on Professor Gobo to hand over a gift to Professor OSSOME, I would just like to remind colleagues that this conversation is continuing tomorrow. And tomorrow Professor OSSOME will be speaking Kodesria. So, yes. I asked, the secretaries to distribute the flyer. I don't know if you have received it, but it's tomorrow from 10 to 12 in the Dr. Miriam Makeba is the post-lecture seminar. The title is Codestra and Africa's Contemporary Intellectual Dilemmas. You are invited, Dr. Miriam Makeba, Hall 10 to 12 in this building. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, 2 great women, Dr. Miriam Makeba, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Professor OSSOME. Today's just a beautiful day for us. So, Prof, a lunch is served after Professor Onyancha has done the vote of thanks and officially closing this session. Prof. Kobo. And then we'll ask for a photo while people are walking out to have lunch, with the college management, with the gift and the speaker.
Okay, so Prof, on behalf of SAGES, under the leadership of Professor Ngosi and Professor Mashao and Professor Madisa, who's our school director, I wish to give you this as a token of appreciation. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. You said earlier you've long wanted to come to UNISA, and we really appreciate your presence today, and we hope it is not for the last time that you come. So please accept this from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you so much.
Yes, colleagues, I believe that it is in the afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon to those who are also joining us virtually. I have been given a simple but very important task, especially in an African perspective. For the youngsters in the room and those who are watching us, and including my children, who usually don't say thank you, this is a thank you session. Because I have come to realize that as time goes by, we change a lot. Things have changed. But the African in me, or me being an African man, we have been brought up to bow and say thank you when something's been done well for us and all that. So let me take this opportunity, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, to first and foremost express our sincere gratitude to the Executive Dean of the College of Human Sciences, Professor ZZ Ngozi, who has just walked out because of another engagement. And on behalf of the College of Human Sciences, we want to extend that gratitude to the Vice Chancellor, who was supposed to be here but sent Professor Nkosi, and through the Deputy Executive Dean, I want to pass that vote of thanks to the Vice Chancellor. The second, in line of that, going down that kind of protocol, I would like to appreciate Professor MARILYN OSSOME, or simply as she is known even on Google Scholar, Lynn OSSOME, for gracing us with her profound knowledge and enlightening perspectives on imperialism and crisis of social reproduction in Africa. Professor OSSOME, this shouldn't be the last that we see you at UNISA. We want to hope that going forward we can establish a very strong relationship between the College of Human Sciences, if not UNISA, at least I'm being selfish here, if not UNISA, at least the College of Human Sciences, which houses one of the largest schools of social sciences in the continent, with CODESRIA, which also specializes in that regard. And we want to hope that we can also establish a very strong relationship between our researchers in the area of feminism and feminism, women theorization, and all that, together with the CODESRIA, so that we may forge ahead in scholarship. Third, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Winnie. Winnie, you have been splendid in organizing this together with his colleagues in the College of Human Sciences. And today, you see, I also tried to dress African. Although I've not dressed the African way, but Winnie always comes to this event in a very serious attire, and to show what it means. And please put your hands together for Winnie in a special way. And I won't forget those who worked together with Winnie. They are in the house, and therefore I want to thank them for that. We'd also like to acknowledge the academics in the room and those who are watching us, and the non-academic staff who have joined us. Thank you so much for your presence. Lastly, but not least, we'd like to express our heartfelt thanks to each and every one of you in the audience today. Your presence here signifies the importance you place on Africa Speaks and the value you attach to the critical conversations driving progress in our continent. Your active involvement contributes to the collective effort to address the challenges faced by Africa and work towards a better future for all. Now, I was told by Winnie to close the meeting, but I wish that I don't think that I've got the ability to do that in the presence of my Deputy Executive Dean, who is in the room. So please, sir, can you come and close this meeting? I cannot close it while you are sitting here. Thank you so much, colleagues, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Professor Onyansha. I will not say much. Safe to say, lunch is served. So this meeting is adjourned.